Hello, welcome to part 3 of week 7 of the ECE 9013 course. In this part, we're going to talk about why do we use object-oriented programming and classes and objects, and we will discuss the concept of information hiding. So, as we mentioned, the question that is often raised is why do we use object-oriented programming paradigm and the classes of objects? This is because such a structure helps us mimic real life. So basically, we can group different objects as part of the same type. So for example, here we can have a class called cat, and within that class we have 3 different objects of 3 different cats, so 3 different instances. Similarly, here we have a class called rabbit in which we have 3 different instances of that class. So as we mentioned earlier, groups of objects, they have attributes. We define 2 types of attributes. The first is the data attribute, which is basically a characteristic to represent the object. So it answers the question what it is. So as an example, for a coordinate, the data attribute is the x and y values. For an animal, it can be the age and name. The second type of attribute is the procedural attributes, or what we call methods. These attributes answer the question what it does. So basically, how can we interact with the object? So as we mentioned in the earlier example, for a coordinate, one possible method is finding the distance between 2 object instances. For an animal, it could be making a sound. So here, this is another example of how we can define a class. We use the keyword class, we define its name to be animal, and we define its class parent, which is its object. Then we define the initialization. So we set the age value to be age and name to be none. And here, this is one instance called myAnimal of type or class animal that has an age of 3. So name is a data attribute, although we don't initialize it with any value initially. Now, the getter and setter methods are methods to retrieve the value of the data attributes and change the value of the data attributes. So the getter basically allows us to retrieve or get the value associated with the data attribute, and the setter methods are methods to assign values for these attributes. So these getters and setters need or should be used outside of class to access data attributes. So for example, here we instantiate an instance called A of type animal with age 3. As we mentioned earlier, we use the dot notation to access the attribute, whether it's a data attribute or a method. So although this is valid, it's much better to use the get and set methods to access these data attributes rather than directly accessing the data attribute in order to ensure that the attributes remain private. So authors of the class definition can actually change the data attribute variable names. So for example, here we are renaming the age variable to be years, if we are accessing data attributes outside the class and class definition changes, we may get errors. However, if outside the class we use the getters and setters methods instead of the actual attribute name, first of all, this is a good style. It's easy to maintain the code and it prevents bugs. And again, even if we change in the class definition the name of the one attribute, we don't need to change anything else in the code outside. That's why it's better to use the getter and setter methods. So, as we mentioned, Python is not great at information hiding because it allows us to access the data from outside the class definition. As an example, we can print a.age. And it allows us to write to the data attributes from outside the class definition, like in this case. And it also allows us to create data attributes for an instance from outside the class definition, such as a.size equal to tiny. However, it's not a good style to do any of these. Another important concept is the default arguments. So default arguments for formal parameters are used if no actual argument is given. So for example, if we define the set function or the setter method to be new name empty, if we don't give it a value, it will set it as empty. But if there is a value, that's what we assign to the data attribute name. So for example, here in this case, if we call the set method name without giving any argument to the method, and we print the output, it would give us an empty. And in this case, if in case we give it an argument or we pass an argument and call that command, we get the name assigned. Thank you.